and welcome to our second week with Dr. Ravi Ravindra. We wanted just to welcome you to the Crotona Institute. We're onto our online program. So the format usually follows, it's usually that Ravi Ji will speak for about an hour, and then we'll have a little bit of a break for about 10 minutes. And then we will have an exchange. And so participants are really, more than welcome. Don't feel shy. Don't be hesitant about asking questions or giving your reflections or thoughts, because it really enhances the whole program. And a question that you may have, somebody else may be too shy to ask. So it's not a bad thing to be asking a question. There's no such thing as a stupid question. So with that, we will get started.
Okay. Well, as we have done in the past, to find at least a few minutes of trying to quieten our mind, this is almost the very first entry in the Yoga Sutra book, literally saying the purpose of yoga is stop all the movements of the mind. So take a few minutes. Again, many of these things you have heard me say that earlier, but I myself repeat them for my own purpose. Namely, I did not create myself. Very subtle spiritual energies. Of course, the labels vary. God, Allah, Brahma, Absolute, or some other name. These very divine energies have created me, created you. And this energy enters into our body through breath. It is not my breath in my body. It is the divine breath keeping this body alive for a few decades. A simple recognition of this idea itself brings about a slight change in the mental thinking about things. How can I more and more subtly connect with this higher energy? And also, you have heard me say, I invite all of us to have an attitude of prayer, which is to say, to submitting to something subtler, higher than ourselves, and wishing to invite this energy to touch me deeply, but to find a posture of meditation, because what we are trying to do is to look deeper and deeper within, not outside. So take a few moments, first of all, to become aware of the fact that breathing is taking place in you without holding your breath outside or inside. Simply paying attention to the breath automatically deepens the breath. Also, in order to receive these subtle energies, more and more receptivity is required from my side. And the fundamental requirement of receptivity is deeper and deeper relaxation, freedom from my fears, from my tensions, freedom even from my knowledge. Each one of us knows many things, but even the most intelligent person could not possibly know everything there is to know. Not a call towards ignorance, but a freedom from what I know, so that I can be surprised by something. So more and more relaxation. welcoming these subtle energies to come into me, paying attention to the breath, because this is how this energy comes into my body. Breathing in as if I am breathing through my skull, or if you are familiar with the yoga literature, this is the Sahasradhara chakra, which is to say a center of gravity slightly above the head, so that this energy can enter into me through my head. And placing your out breath into your whole body, right down to the toes, with the attitude of welcoming this energy, inviting it to nourish the whole of my organism. So it is assisted if I find an appropriate posture so that this energy can move in my body without restriction. If you're sitting on a chair, to make sure that your knees are below your buttocks. And touching the ground. And maintaining a verticality, but without becoming rigid in any sense. And watch as carefully as you can, quite impartially, without approval or disapproval, what is going on in your mind. Always a very strong suggestion from like and dislike, but simply becoming aware of whatever is going on, and then its quality begins to change. Because awareness carries energy. Now take 3 more breaths, then we will attend to certain remarks of Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras. But even during our being together, whether you're listening or if you're speaking, either way, whenever you can be a little aware of your breath, take a moment. Because that breath is what carries the divine spirit in us. Patanjali, a great sage, is said to be the author of the Yoga Sutras. This may or may not be true historically, but it doesn't matter from our point of view. And a remark in the Yoga Sutras is yoga is for cultivating samadhi and for weakening the hindrances. I'll come back to this today. This is what we'll be focusing on. What is the purpose of yoga? Maybe some of you know And some of these figures that I'm about to mention right now are more than 15 years old. I was invited to give a talk, actually, in fact, in Ojai by Yoga Anytime people, where the talk was called Yoga of Business and Business of Yoga, because several $billion worth of material related with yoga is being sold every year. This is about 15 years old information. And nearly 10% of the US population was involved in practicing some form of yoga, mostly physical yoga to enhance their sex appeal, basically. But that is really not the main purpose of yoga, which we'll be today speaking about. What Patanjali says is the purpose of yoga, is for cultivating samadhi and for weakening the hindrances that interfere with. And what is samadhi? We'll speak about this in a few moments. And also at that time, the average income of the people or the family income of the people participating in yoga was more than $100,000 a year. 10% of the American population was engaged in this. So now the numbers may have increased or decreased. I don't actually know. This is about 15 years ago. So in a way, then there has been occasionally an argument. Well, yoga should be removed from the schools because it's Hinduism interfering with Christianity. So here I want to draw your remark, first of all, here. Yoga is a science par excellence of inner transformation. There is nothing sectarian or exclusively Indian about yoga as a science. I give this simple example. The law of gravitation was enunciated by Isaac Newton, an Englishman, but if it applies only in England, it cannot be a true law. It is true, on the other hand, that several words get attached from the languages which are the original languages in which the particular teaching was brought. For example, in much of the scientific language, you would see the word for gold is AU, which any English person would think really rather crazy. Why not GD would be for gold? But it comes from because initially so much of the scientific work was being driven and written in Greek or Latin languages. So some of those words come. The reason I'm giving that example, similarly in yoga, some of the words will come from Sanskrit because that's where it originated. But that doesn't mean that one needs to imagine that it applies only in India or applies only to people who speak anything in Sanskrit. And the two most important texts of yoga are the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras, which is attributed to Patanjali as he's the main author of this. I actually undertook a deep study of both of these texts, and ended up making my own translation and writing commentary on it, because my teacher, Jean de Salzman, would periodically ask me about yoga. And I felt that if I wished to really respond to this with any integrity, I needed to deeply study the important texts of yoga. So in fact, my first of these two was Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. That was published 19 years after her death. But I'm quite certain that she would still be aware of what I have suggested, because I needed to really wrestle with this to be able to answer her question more properly. Now, here I'm intentionally giving you references so that you can, of course, sometimes the translations are a little differently made, but that's inevitable. Yoga is stopping all the movements of the mind. Sanskrit is yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Now, sometimes it is translated as yoga is cultivating stillness, or yoga is stopping thinking, or various other ways it gets translated. But this is the literal translation of yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is stopping all the movements of the mind. And then we see in the Bhagavad Gita, abandoning all desires born of selfish will and restraining completely the multitude of senses with the mind, one should slowly cease from all mental activity with awareness held firmly. Having fixed the mind in the self, that is with a capital S, self, one should think of nothing at all, whenever and to whatever side the restless and the unquiet mind wanders away. It should be reined in and brought into subjugation to the self. That is the call from the Bhagavad Gita. Then Patanjali says stillness or silence develops through abhyas and vairagya. These are two Sanskrit words which is very difficult to give one English word translation, but one can still have some translation. So I have given abhyas can be as practice, but it can also be sustaining something, staying with it. Vairagya is detachment or non-identification or freedom from me. So stillness develops through abhyas and vairagya. Abhyas is the effort of remaining present. Continuous care and attention for a long time establishes the practice. So clearly, nobody is suggesting that it is easy or cheap or quick. Continuous care and attention for a long time establishes this practice. Then vairagya is the mastery over the craving for what has been seen or heard. Higher vairagya, Patanjali actually makes this distinction between, you probably have come across somebody who has made a lot of money, is very, very rich and very important in a business, but suddenly at a certain age beginning to feel, what's the point of all this? I'm soon going to die. So that can then lead them to a detachment or vairagya from just getting more and more money. But that is arising from what they see here. Patanjali makes a distinction between two kinds of vairagya. Lower vairagya, what I just described is lower vairagya. But he says higher vairagya arises from a vision of the transcendent being. Purusha is the Sanskrit word for it. You could call it God temporarily. And leads to the cessation of craving for the things of the world. Some of you may have read this, and John of the Cross actually describes that for him, real detachment came only when he first had a vision of God. This is so one can be detached because I don't like this world, it is just stupid, I'm carrying on, I have enough money. That is one kind of detachment. But the suggestion here is that the real detachment or the higher vairagya comes from a vision of something subtler, higher, or of God. And John of the Cross actually describes precisely exactly that. Then a clear and tranquil mind results from cultivating friendliness towards those who are happy, compassion towards those who suffer, joy towards the virtuous, and impartiality towards wrongdoers. I have given precise references here. You may have slightly different translation, but essentially the same meaning. Very strong suggestion of even the wrongdoers, how can one be impartial towards them? Then, you see, that was in the first chapter, so far, all the things that I quoted, where yoga is described as quieting all the movements of the mind. And it's a very strong emphasis, actually, in a lot of religious literature that the highest cannot be described. So one indicates something negatively, that it is stopping the movements of the mind rather than trying to describe the kind of stillness or trying to describe what one actually experiences. So it's like what is called negative theology, has more virtue to it because it is denying something that we can actually watch. We can be aware of the movements of the mind. So to say to stop the movements of the mind is more likely to be able to be expressed correctly because one cannot describe the quality of the stillness or the quality of the silence. But the second chapter actually describes it slightly differently. What is the aim of yoga? But first of all, the first sutra in the second chapter describes what is the practice of yoga. Sometimes that is, in the Sanskrit expression for that is Kriya Yoga. So some people actually refer to their yoga practice as Kriya Yoga. But it's the practice of yoga consists of self-discipline. Who could disagree with this? Nothing is possible to be done without some self-discipline. Self-study, very strongly emphasized, and dedication to God, Ishvara Pranidhan. But this God is not up there, it's God inside. Very strong emphasis in the whole of the Indian tradition that your deepest self is identically the same as the highest reality. That is actually called the supreme identity. Atma is identically the same as Brahma. So here, this is the call to dedication to that deeper and deeper level within yourself, not something outside. Then explicitly describing here the purpose of yoga, a little differently from the first chapter. Yoga is for cultivating samadhi and for weakening the hindrances. I've given you the Sanskrit word, hindrances or obstacles, impediments. These are all possible translation of the word klesha. Impediment, obstacle, hindrance. Samadhi, sadly, these days in India, seems to be more or less like a state in which you're out of your mind, you're sort of unable to think clearly, etc. Samadhi, as described by Patanjali, is actually, I therefore jumped ahead one chapter, but I'll return to second chapter right away. But he describes Samadhi is the state when the self is not. When there is awareness only of the object of meditation. Let me take a minute here to give a slight background to this. A famous German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, I'm sure Walter Erhard would agree with me, he's a well-known philosopher. He wrote a book called A Critique of Pure Reason, at least that's the English translation, Critique of Pure Reason, in which he strongly points out that scientific knowledge can never be objective knowledge. Precisely because the object is in giving something, but our mind is also interfering. And in the spiritual practice, and already I had quoted this from Christ's remark, unless you leave yourself behind. There are different ways of saying it, but here, very carefully describing samadhi, when the self is not. When the mind, one is not introducing anything from myself. This may surprise people because of the language, because generally we say science is dealing with objective knowledge and our own spiritual knowledge tends to be subjective. It's just the reverse. The call actually is in spiritual practice to come to objective knowledge, by which one means Nothing is introduced by my mind. It is only the object that I'm looking at. And Emmanuel Kant tried to point out that scientific knowledge can never be wholly objective. But what is the great quality of scientific knowledge is that it is intersubjective. Somebody at Harvard could come up with an idea, but then somebody in Germany or some other university could try to verify this, check this, whether it works or not. So it is intersubjective, but it still remains subjective. The human mind is coming in there. And the call in the Yoga Sutras, this is a starting point here, that the mind, I'm quoting actually from the Yoga Sutras, that the mind needs to become like a completely clear diamond, which does not introduce its own color on anything that it sees. It reveals the object as it is. Which is why, strictly speaking really completely logically correctly, what the Buddha sees or says, he's speaking about objective knowledge. Similarly, what Christ is saying is objective knowledge. It's not subjective. They're free of their own mind, free of their own me. It is nothing to do with their being restricted because somebody is born in India, therefore they're looking at it from an Indian point of view, or somebody is born in China, so they're looking from it. Nothing to do with that. Complete freedom from the mind. That is the call. How many people succeed is a very different matter. But let me return to second chapter again. The very next sutra, then what are the obstacles or the hindrances? The Sanskrit word is klesha. Ignorance, the sense of a separate self, attraction, aversion, sometimes it is translated as like and dislike, and clinging to the status quo. In the whole of the Indian tradition, the emphasis is very strongly on objective knowledge, vidya or gyan. Avidya is the opposite of that, so that becomes ignorance. And as he says here, the main obstacle is avidya. Let me quickly go to the next. Avidya is the cause of all the other obstacles, whether dormant, attenuated, intermittent, or fully active. The reason I'm pointing this out, because in the whole of the Abrahamic tradition, the main problem is lack of faith. In the whole of the Indian tradition, the emphasis, the problem is lack of right knowledge, true knowledge. It's a very fundamental difference between the two. And then like, dislike, I will speak a little bit more about all of these things in a moment. So avidya or ignorance is the fundamental. And then what is avidya? Seeing the transient as eternal, the impure as pure, dissatisfaction as pleasure, the non-self as self. The last expression is very much emphasized in the Upanishads as well. As long as I'm not able to connect with or see the deepest self, I'm in ignorance. Then asmita, remember, let me just again quickly go back here. These are the obstacles. Avidya, then asmita, which is like a separate self, which is basically identifying myself with one drop in the whole ocean of being, forgetting that I am connected with this whole large ocean of life, all coming from the divine side. And that is really the basis of me, asmita. And then raga is attraction or like, aversion, dvesha is dislike, and then clinging to the status quo, abhinivesha. I'll come back to all of these again. So asmita literally means I am this or I am that. Namely, I am identifying myself with some small part of this whole large nation of being. Then he says, Patanjali says a little bit more about it. Asmita is the misidentification of the power of seeing with what is seen. I look at my body and I claim that that is me, forgetting that that is connected with the whole ocean of being. Raga arises from dwelling on pleasant experiences. It's a natural tendency. In fact, sometimes people wish to repeat. Any of you who have been married for a long time sometimes say, the husband says to the wife or the wife says to the husband, let's go for another honeymoon somewhere, trying to repeat some pleasant experiences. It is a very common demand. Then dvesha arises from clinging to unpleasant experiences. Now, it may be surprising, but try to think about this more. We are much more stuck with unpleasant experiences than with the pleasant ones. If somebody says to me in the morning, somewhere in a gathering, oh, what you said was just nonsense, that stays in my mind for a much longer time than somebody who said, oh, what you said was nice and wonderful. Similarly, a child could be assaulted in one way or the other, even at the age of 10. Sometimes that will, depending on the quality of the assault, will stay in their mind even at the age of 36, 40, 50, until somehow with psychiatric help or this or that, they can be freed of it. In fact, let me remind you, the whole profession of psychiatry depends on this idea that we are attached to events of suffering. The whole profession of psychiatry depends on this particular notion. And in fact, it is such a strong connection that it's much easier for us to forget something that was pleasant than to forget something which was unpleasant from our point of view. Especially if somebody insults one, even the countries get attached to that if they lost in a battle. Especially in Canada, we have this very strong sense. And this is such an important idea, and most people don't often realize this. This is why I'm quoting you. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna defines yoga in many different ways. And this is one of the definitions. Yoga is breaking the bond with suffering. This is in the 6th chapter. I've given you a precise reference here. Because we are very deeply connected with our suffering, much more deeply than with our pleasures. Then abhinivesh, much to my surprise, actually, sometimes I have seen even well-known theosophists translating this as abhinivesh is wish to be born again or something like this. Abhinivation is simply inertia. Any of you who know even elementary physics, the first law of motion of Newton is that a particle in motion continues to be in motion unless it is stopped by some force from the outside. But Patanjali, or most of the spiritual practice, is psychologically oriented rather than physically oriented. So abhinavesh is the automatic tendency for continuity it is really a psychological inertia. I personally know people who get fed up with their job, then they give up that, and soon they end up getting another job which is very similar to this previous one. In fact, my own younger brother married somebody, divorced her, after a little while remarried her again, and again divorced her. So that inertia is very, very common practice. So look at, we don't need to just believe what Patanjali is saying, but look at your own situation. What is it that you want to keep repeating in one way or the other? What is one's inertia? So according to Patanjali, this is another feature. And then he says these subtle obstacles or kleshas can be overcome by reversing the natural flow and returning to the source. Now, what is the natural flow? Prakriti, literally the word prakriti, which is translated as nature, literally it means to act outside. Prakriti, acting outside. That's the literal meaning of that word. And call, according to Patanjali, is to reverse that tendency, to act inside, to look more and more deeply inside. So this is what he's recommending. These subtle obstacles can be overcome by reversing the natural flow and returning to the source. The natural flow is outward, and call is to move inward. And then he says their effects can be reduced by meditation. Dhyan. Dhyan is the Sanskrit word which gets translated as meditation. Some of you may have heard me this. I find it just an amusing statement. So when Buddhism went to China, the word dhyan was not translated. It was just pronounced in a Chinese way as Huan. And then when it went to Korea, it was pronounced as Son. And when it went to Japan, it was pronounced as Zen. Zen is just the Japanese pronunciation of the Korean pronunciation of the Chinese pronunciation of dhyan. Literally, Zen simply means meditation. Dhyan, it comes from the Sanskrit root. Then very strong emphasis in the whole of the Indian tradition, and here Patanjali's Yoga Sutras I'm pointing out, from self-study, Swadhyaya. I think I quoted the other day remark of Krishnamurti, yesterday, or not yesterday, but last time when we met, last Friday, where he says there can be no wisdom without self-inquiry. The expression Swadhyaya gets translated as self-study or self-inquiry or self-observation. So don't get stuck with one thing or the other. Or self-knowledge, that's another translation. So from self-study, one reaches union with the chosen deity, Ishta Devata. And then Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita also very much emphasizes it. There are some who practice yajna. Yajna, by the way, literally gets translated as sacrifice, but it more or less means sacrifice is connecting with the sacred. That's the root of the word sacrifice. So in a way, every spiritual practice involves some kind of sacrifice, yajna. So yajna becomes any spiritual practice. So there are some who practice yajna by offering their material goods, others who undertake austere efforts and practice of yoga as yajna, and for still others with serious vows, yajna consists of self-inquiry and sacred knowledge. So self-inquiry is very strongly emphasized in the whole of the spiritual practice anywhere. But again, something some of you may have heard me say this earlier, how there is a kind of a natural tendency in any culture for some degeneration. If you look at contemporary Sanskrit English dictionaries for the word swadhyay, the first translation they give is reading sacred books. Literally, there is no problem with that word. Swa is self, adhyay means study. So self-study, this is absolutely clear. But that has now become the fourth or the fifth meaning in the contemporary Sanskrit English dictionaries. I actually remember once saying this to Krishnamurti. We had a conversation about it. And I have never heard him use this word in public, but he said, "Damn it, sir, what is the point of studying sacred books unless you study the book of yourself?" This is Krishnamurti's remark saying to me, "Damn it, sir, what is the point of studying sacred books if you don't study the book of yourself?" So a very strong requirement to study the book of yourself, partly because self-knowledge automatically leads to self-transformation. More impartial the knowledge, quicker the result. Which is why then a serious person gets more and more interested not in what I see, but the fact that I see. Then one wants to enhance the quality of one's seeing. If the Buddha is engaged in self-knowledge, guaranteedly it is at a deeper level than if I am engaged in self-knowledge. So one then becomes more interested not in what I see, because the whole universe is in me. It's endless. But in the quality of my seeing, that becomes more important, because awareness is the mechanism of transformation. And two important philosophers in the Western philosophy, Plotinus, and I think it was, I'm just forgetting the name of the other philosopher, who very much emphasized this, that knowing and being are very intimately connected with each other. I'm putting it slightly differently here. It's not just ordinary knowing, it's particularly self-knowing or self-knowledge, deeply connected with self-transformation. Then Patanjali continues, steady vision of viveka, discernment, although I think I mentioned maybe last time when we met here, it sometimes gets translated as discrimination. For example, the famous book of Shankara, philosopher in India, called Vivek Chudamani, its English translation, which is available on the internet, you can check, is called Crest Jewel of Discrimination, which now in the English language has acquired a slightly different meaning. So I recommend to you the word discernment for Viveka. So steady vision of discernment is the way to overcome ignorance. And then when Patanjali speaks about there are 8 limbs of yoga, it's called Ashtanga Yoga. Sometimes people, they say, we are practicing Ashtanga Yoga. So every group of practitioners has a label for their yoga. So, but there also he mentions again, among the practicing limbs of yoga, impurity is destroyed and radiance of jnana leads to viveka. Very strong emphasis on practice, not just easily obtained result. When the vritti, remember vrittis are the movements of the mind, as I quoted earlier here. So when the vrittis are diminished, the mind is like a clear diamond, which reflects what is before it. Then fusion of perceiver, perceiving, and the object of perception takes place. Their insight is full of order. Some of you may remember Krishnamurti very often used to say, observer is the same as the observed. Patanjali is actually pointing out 3 things are the same, not only 2. Observer or perceiver but also the process of perceiving, as well as what is perceived. So observer, as well as the observed, as well as observing, are all in one. This is what Patanjali says. Then the kind of knowledge, the trouble is in English, we just keep translating these words as knowledge. But these days, scientific knowledge is supposed to be the ultimate reality of knowledge. It's the, people end up saying extra scientia nulla verita. Outside scientific knowledge, there is no truth. There is no wisdom. But the kind of knowledge we are talking about in the Yoga Sutras is this knowledge is knowledge beyond thought. This knowledge is different from the knowledge obtained by testimony or by inference. Jnana, born of viveka, is liberating, comprehensive, eternal, and freed of time sequence. Clearly, a great sage would have exactly that kind of knowledge. Look, as Christ was able to say, before Abraham was, I am. Because his knowledge is beyond time sequence. But the very next verse, see, this is John 8:58 and this is John 8:59. Then they picked up stones to throw at Jesus, but he hid himself and slipped out of the temple precincts. Because it makes no sense at an ordinary level that one is freed of the time sequence. But that's the kind of knowledge that is being spoken about here. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali emphasizes that Purusha, that is, you could call it God if you like, knows not with the mind but through the mind. You see the distinction between what I'm trying to point out? A telescope doesn't see. It's the scientist who sees through the telescope. Then the telescope can have a good quality or a bad quality. So therefore, there is no reason to be against the mind. The mind can be clear or it can be obstructed. So, but mind is not the seer. Purusha knows not with the mind, but through the mind. The mind, the instrument of perception, interferes less and less as it becomes freer and freer of subjectivity. The progressive freedom to be attained in yoga is an increasing freedom not for myself, but freedom from myself. Then the mind can become a proper instrument of perception and can act in the service of the real. So there is no reason to be against the mind. Mind is an instrument like a telescope. The question is, do I have a good telescope or a bad telescope? So part of the practice of yoga is to cleanse the mind, to make it like a clear diamond, as Patanjali said. But again, I just wish to remind everybody here, there is a bit of a tendency to think Purusha or God is up there. Now, Purusha is not located at any singular point somewhere outside Prakriti, outside nature. The whole vertical axis of awareness, orthogonal to the material manifestation of Prakriti, represented by the horizontal plane, shares in the being of Purusha. So Purusha, or awareness, consciousness, God, can be represented at different levels along the, we say it vertically simply to point to something subtler than ourselves, higher than ourselves. And the whole manifested universe we end up representing by a horizontal dimension, which is one way of looking at the cross. Vertical dimension, trying to connect with the spiritual energies. Horizontal dimension, connecting with the world where we are, with the neighbors. So along this vertical axis of conscious energy, of seeing or consiring, we can see more and more clearly and impartially as our organs of perception are cleansed and the vrittis and the kleshas are diminished. Purusha is only the witnessing consciousness, or sakshi bhav in Sanskrit. For Purusha to act, it must be associated with Prakriti. Purusha cannot act without Prakriti. Another way of saying God cannot act without material things in the world, body, mind. And here is a remark of Ishwar Krishna in famous book, Sankhyakarika. By the way, that particular text is more or less the basis of the ideas in the Bhagavad Gita, very close to it. Purusha without Prakriti is lame. Prakriti without Purusha is blind. It's easier to look at ourselves. A spiritual element which is keeping my body alive, but that spiritual element, I could now, Purusha can be called spirit. Spirit without body is lame. Body without the spirit is blind. Spirit brings the vision, what needs to be done. But body is the, I'm including the mind in it. Body, mind are the instrument to assist the spirit. Now I'm suggesting to you an exercise if you wish to try it. How does your body-mind, which is individualized Prakriti, serve the spiritual energy, which is individualized Purusha in you? You have, I have, each one of us has a divine particle. That is the only reason why we are alive. Otherwise, I couldn't create myself. So how does my body-mind serve this divine particle in me? Then is your life exclusively your personal project, or is some subtle energy, which may be called an angel or a deva in the traditional terminology, is this subtle energy interested in you for alive for a few decades, keeping you alive for a few decades? You can, if these questions or suggestions interest you, pay attention to them. Otherwise, you can, at my website, there are many articles and videos, etc. You can look at them and you can write to me. I have my email address here. Now, I suggest, unless Ananya, you have another suggestion, that I can get rid of the slides unless there is some specific slide people are very keen to look at. And then we can take 10 minutes or so break and then come, bring your insights, your questions. You don't have to agree, certainly not with me, or really even with Patanjali, or even with Christ or the Buddha. Agreeing, disagreement has nothing to do with it. It's more a question of, do we slightly try to understand what they are saying, and how does it apply to me? And then in the process, I see whether it actually is relevant to what I try or not. So agreement, disagreement has nothing to do with it.
You spoke at the very end of the class about Prakriti serving Purusha, and how could we see that in our own life? And this is a very mysterious question. I wonder if you could speak about how to approach it. How could I, look at that question about how Prakriti in my life can serve Purusha in my life?
In fact, I always suggest that it is important to look at any of the spiritual ideas, how it applies to me. So each one of us is an individualized Prakriti, by which I mean that my body and mind is part of Prakriti as individualized in me. And then each one of us is also individualized Purusha or individualized spirit. Otherwise, I won't be alive. I have said this more than once. It is the soul that has the body, not that the body has the soul. So, according to all the spiritual teachers, of course, we can dismiss all this because we say, well, does the science agree with this? Well, I don't know what science has to do with it. But according to all the spiritual teachers, each of us creatures has been created by a spiritual energy. And then the purpose of that creation is that so that soul that takes on the body, it takes the body, including the ordinary mind, I just keep using the word body, takes on the body as an instrument to assist the evolution of the soul at whatever level it is in me now, to come to a higher level. So this is how, then we say, how can Prakriti in me serve the Purusha in me? Prakriti in me is my body and mind. Purusha in me is my soul, whatever that spiritual element is, at whatever level it is. And then the intention why it has taken on my body is so that it can act as a proper instrument to assist the evolution of this soul. And now, then the question is, what are the kind of actions I need to undertake? And those actions are more and more related with sense of oneness with the others, feeling the sense of unity, and trying to serve and not to be occupied with me, me, me. That is what is repeatedly said by practically all the sages in slightly different words. Unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. Or Ansari of Herat saying, all I know to connect with the beloved is to forget myself. Varieties of ways it gets said. But freedom from just self-occupation, self-advancement, self-approval, etc. That is the call. And then one naturally wishes to serve something and to relate with the others in a more compassionate way. And that's what I was quoting from Patanjali repeatedly. How does one react to others, even those who are doing bad things? Because sometimes people are forced to do bad things, not out of their control. So even for them, he's suggesting compassion rather than just going to try to kill them.
So an effort of compassion, an effort of
Yeah, connecting with Purusha.
connecting with
Or serving the Purusha side in me. I keep saying individualized Purusha in me, as well as individualized Prakriti in me.
so serving the Purusha in me and serving the Purusha in others is the same.
Yes. Yes, this, because the spiritual energy in each person is at a particular level, which is to say the quality of their soul. I think I have said that again, I'm repeating it. Soul is personal. Your soul is different from my soul, but spirit is transpersonal. Sadly, in much of the Christian tradition since the 16th century, these two words have been mixed up. But they mean something quite different in the New Testament, in the original Greek.
At the end of the first session, that there was a picture of a book, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I think it was something about the wisdom of it.
Yeah, the title is The Wisdom of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra.
Is that a new book, Ravi? I haven't seen that.
No, that was initially published in USA in 2009, Then it
Oh.
was published in India. That version you may have seen is the Indian version. It was published in, I think, 2016 or 17 in India.
So I was just wondering, you know, I know you have discussed these topics with us. At least I've been around, and probably most of us have, for many, many sessions on this. And I was thinking it might be helpful to get a copy of that book, The Wisdom of.
Patanjali's Yoga Sutras.
So you would recommend getting that book?
Yes.
Yeah, we've actually studied the Yoga Sutras here, and Ravi G's book is one of the books that many people use because he simplifies it. He breaks it down and he simplifies it and gives a beautiful explanation to each of the sutras. So
Yes, yes, I know we've been doing it for years, but I just thought, you know, for more clarity for my own use, it might be worth getting that book.
I recommend it, although I'm often hesitant saying that because it seems as if I'm trying to sell my books. But also, I should tell you, the publisher who initially published that book went bankrupt.
Oh,
This
no.
happened with me. Actually, 3 publishers who published my books stopped publishing. Either Quest Book is an example of that as well, but for one reason or the other. So in a way, those books are now available only through us.
Wow.
So we ended up getting them reprinted under a sort of, we created our own publishing house called Shala Press. So, but it's the same book. It's just now printed differently. And
Yes. Well, thank you.
so if you order the same book through Amazon, you end up paying at least $10 more than if you just write to me to order that.
It sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Tanner, go ahead.
Tanner, please.
Hi, yes, I have, I guess, kind of a practical question about the sutras. As sort of well, I'm definitely a beginning yoga instructor, but someone who wishes to continue to expand that area of my life as a teacher and a student. And I do find it really difficult to incorporate the sutras, especially in a 1 hour session, which is basically the version that we have in America so much of how we've like commodified yoga. It's always a 1 hour class that tends to be the preferred method. Um, and I try to bring in certain readings and things like that to give people time to think about something beyond just, like you mentioned, their body or the changes they wish to make to the physical self in class. But I find that through through the classes that I've taught so far, I have trouble getting students to get past just like, oh, I'm too cold or I'm too hot, or it kind of just almost feels like the yoga is making people more fussy sometimes. And so I'm just wondering how can I bring this to people in a way that doesn't become like a hierarchical, this is what you have to do to practice yoga, and still give people that maybe just want to move a little bit, something that they're into as well. And is that even possible?
Yes, well, it's not easy. As you know, in any subject, it's not only about yoga. For example, since I was a professor for many years in the university, sometimes teaching physics, later philosophy, etc., whatever one is teaching, there are always many students who just want to get the marks and get on with it. They're not really even particularly interested in the subject. So this is always going to be the case. So don't imagine that everybody in your yoga class is going to take it seriously to study something deeper. But one thing that might possibly help, if you just simply mention in the class that yoga is not only for physical health, that it is a whole transformation of one's entire nature inside, and that therefore it will be useful for those who are interested to study some relevant books.
Hmm.
Then if you just mention some books, I'm not trying to say that just mention only my book. There are, for example, there is a book by Deshikachar, which I think is really quite interesting. I'm just forgetting the title of that book. In any case, you can look it up on the internet, and Deshikachar. And so I think then you would find out of, if there are 30 people in your class, maybe 2 or 3 of them might be interested in getting hold of this book and reading something. And then sometimes they may say to you, well, that doesn't make sense to me. Then you could try to speak something to them outside the class. In the class itself, there is only an hour. And really, by the time one does a few postures and then wants to have it at the end, what we call shavasana, which is just resting. And literally, it's actually a reminder of death. People forget this. Shavasana literally means corpse pose. And it's a reminder that whatever I regard my body to be, it's going to die. But it's something one constantly forgets. So my suggestion is just to mention 1 or 2 ideas that yoga has many other purposes, and that, for example, it is repeatedly said in the Indian tradition that the Buddha practiced yoga. And actually, even BBC made a film about Christ having practiced yoga. But people don't, in the Catholic Church, they don't like to believe any of this. But it doesn't matter. Yoga doesn't simply mean what we have in the Yoga Sutras. Yoga is really, literally, the word yoga means to connect with something. In fact, I point out in one of my articles the word religion, which also means religio, to reconnect. If you wanted to translate religion into Sanskrit, it will be yoga, because yoga has exactly the same root, to connect with something. So you can mention some of these things, but out of, as I said, if there are 30 people, probably 3 of them at the most will be interested in getting rid of, or not getting rid of, acquiring a copy of a book to read it carefully and to speak with you. But that may have to be outside the yoga 1-hour class teaching.
Thank you.
Ravi, is this the heart of yoga? Is that what you're thinking of?
Art of Yoga, that's right, by Deshikachar.
Okay, I forwarded that on to Tanner.
Thank you.
No, Deshikachar, he was actually my yoga teacher. I mentioned that. In fact, then he insisted that I should become a yoga teacher. And I said, I have many other engagements. I can't just take this on. Then he interviewed me, and for his yoga students, he used to have that interview as part of their thing. They had to listen to that and reflect on this, because we talked about yoga. No, I met him many, many times, actually. In fact, whenever he was alive in Chennai, whenever he went there, we insisted on having dinner together, etc. No, he's a good man. Actually, his father was Krishnamacharya, who was also, his son-in-law is Iyengar. So both Iyengar and Deshikachar are very much connected with Krishnamacharya. And even Krishnamacharya, I met him. He taught me one particular posture in yoga. No, I'm an old man, by this time I have met many of these people. You people are so young. I'm surprised that I'm still alive here. In any case, any other comment or question?
There's a comment from David. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question, but I also wanted to share one thing about the Yoga Sutras, because there's 2 people who've been teaching the Yoga Sutras, and they do these long workshops, but they bring music to it, and you embody the Yoga Sutra. So you dance to it, you act it out. So it's this whole embodiment thing. And they've been doing this for probably 12 or 15 years. They'll do week-long workshops just on the Yoga Sutras with musicians. So it's a way to actually get it in your bones. So that might be something you want to look into with, I think, Lauren Roche and Camille Maureen. But they do teach that work, and it's a powerful way to embody that expression, that wisdom.
Okay, now we let Andrea, you had raised your hand earlier, you put it down. Do you want to say something?
I did, and then it kind of slipped my mind, but I'll give it a try. So I wanted to just go back and read the part of the sutra that you brought for us today, where it says a clear and tranquil mind results from cultivating friendliness towards those who are happy, compassion towards those who suffer, joy towards the virtuous, and impartiality towards the wrongdoers. And what I like about this is that it's like an instruction manual. Like, I'm a yoga teacher, but I like to go to yoga class because I don't want to have to figure it out for myself every day. And so it's really nice to have these clear instructions sometimes. And it's even telling you, like, if you do this, you'll get this, you know? um, and I like you're talking about the diamond, like I appreciate that clarity that comes to it. And I think for me, with the part that we're discussing right now, like the most important part is at the end there where it says impartiality. It's not saying I need to love the person. It's not saying I need to love what they do. It's not, you know, and to me, forgiveness is impartiality because it's unhooking them from me. I'm
Yeah.
releasing them from, you know, the obsession or the anger or the whatever. And then I can, like you were saying, like I can take the energy that I was expending on that anger and frustration and self-righteousness and put it towards something else, putting it toward trying to make a change, you know? And I think I think forgiveness is often given as this, it's often taken as this idea that, oh, it means that what they did is okay. And I think it's less about them and more about me. This is all about the inner workings, right? This is all about the internal work of, you know, making
Yeah.
a connection. So I wanted to add that.
Walter, please.
Yes. Today, I have a very special question concerning establishing the mind in stillness. By the end of the day, before going to bed towards midnight, I tried to have a phase of complete stillness. And within the last few months, normally this takes just about 22, 35, 40 minutes. And sometimes the mind is rather busy, monkey mind. Sometimes it's established in silence. And within the last few months, I've had several phases where I came back from this stillness and looked at the clock, and it was 1:30. And the question I have now is, how can I be sure that this was stillness, this was meditation, and not sleep? How can I tell the difference? I'm doing this meditation in a sitting pose. Because of my back, I have to be in a chair leaning, having something in my back. So falling asleep, falling really asleep would mean I probably would tumble down. But how can I be sure it's not some kind of daydreaming or any other kind of activity that's not real meditation?
No, I think it is a serious question you're raising, and I'm not sure that I have any really specific answer to give to this. Although my impression is that the moments of what you would call daydreaming almost inevitably partly change my posture.
Mm.
And also a kind of it's really not only lack of clarity, it's almost as if the real stillness in my understanding, that my mind is not making its sounds, but everything is much more alive and active, whatever I look at. Whereas this kind of posture of falling asleep, nothing is alive. So if I can impartially look at how I actually experienced something, because real stillness, strictly speaking, is not even absence of sound. I often remind people, your heart is still beating. You can hear that sound. And stillness belongs to a different level of the mind, which is why some people at a high level could be even in the supermarket and have a quiet mind. And somebody could be, as it were, sitting in a yoga posture and not have a quiet mind. Because stillness belongs to a different level of the mind. Because outside world will continue making its sounds. You can't stop it. Your heart will keep beating as long as you're alive. You can't stop that. And your blood moving, you can take your pulse. So one needs to realize that the kind of silence that we are seeking is not absence of sound. It's really connecting with a slightly different level of the mind.
Yes. Well, that's clear to me. It should be some kind of total awareness.
Yes. Yes.
So what I had the impression that there was not there was no awareness sometime in between.
Yes.
I was somehow out of awareness.
Yes. Yeah.
It was quiet. It was stillness, but it was not awareness in my eyes.
But it can be deep sleep. No, this is something, there is ordinary sleep and deep sleep in which one doesn't have dreams or any kind of movement of that kind. But one is not really aware. But the call in the meditation, or what we usually would call having a quiet mind, is enhanced awareness that one is surrounded by, is pervaded by very subtle energies.
Thank you.
I think it's time for us to stop unless somebody else wants to bring. Priscilla, you had your hand raised earlier. Do you wish to say something? Unmute yourself if you want to say something.
Well, I was feeling lately that I'm just so astounded at the fact that every person is a unique individual and everyone has their own journey. I'm responsible for something in myself and for the relationship I have with others, but others have a journey that's been given to them, and sometimes it's really, really terrible, and sometimes it's awful into the world, but how little we control. I see that more and more as I get older. And it helps me with a kind of sense of compassion and recognition that each one has their own journey.
Yeah. No, it is true. I often point out, literally millions of people who don't have sufficient amount of water to drink, sufficient amount of food to have. Did they create that situation themselves? So it's very difficult to sometimes these are just explanations given by people as if because of their previous incarnation or because of this. I don't understand any of this. But the fact is what I just said, literally millions of people who have not sufficient amount of food or water to drink. So in a certain way, we are all very fortunate, whosoever is here, and therefore to see what can be our responsibility. I see Richard,
Compassion on others.
Dick has raised his hand.
How do you distinguish between spirit and the witness part during meditation?
Spirit and what?
Witness. part.
Awareness?
Witness.
A
Wit-
witness.
Witness. Like there's a part observing when I'm thinking, like the witness part. Is that different from spirit?
No, not necessarily, although again, it depends on what one understands by spirit and what one understands by witness. My impression is that the spirit part, so which could also be the witness, doesn't make judgments. It becomes more and more aware of something, and that awareness itself brings about a transformation. But it is not judging it, oh, this is not good, this is good, I should do this, I should not do that. That kind of judgment is not part of the spirit. That's my impression. So reflect on that. And so you folks I hope you don't feel completely disturbed having to come again tomorrow. So I'll see some of you, maybe most of you.